I'm here with Tori Weyers, and Tori is going to give us a little bit of a lesson in composition. So when we talk about composition, what is that?
Basically, it is elements on the page and how they work together. So visual elements, line elements, object elements, shape.
So you brought some examples here. Can we just talk through them for a second?
Definitely. So from this side to this side, this is really about focal point. So these red circles, it's also shape, are really dominant. So your eye is drawn to them. And even though there's lots of other things going on, you keep going back. So they become a really important compositional element because of the focal point concept. This one is active and passive, so there's a lot of color and swirls and mushing around of paint, and then this area really right here is very flat, very calm and blue, so it becomes passive and it gives your eye a place to rest.
You know, a lot of people talk about passive as white space, and the space does not have to be white, it's just a space that allows you to rest.
Correct, yes, and it kind of pushes your eye back in. You go over there and you're like, oh, calm, and then back in.
It's like life.
It is.
The next one?
This is surface division, which sounds not all that exciting, but it's important because it's essentially how you're breaking up your space on your page. And then this last one is foreground and background. Now I know there's also that middle ground that a lot of people kind of leave out, but this one's really pushing the foreground with both this white cutting through the whole piece over top of everything, and then the black. And then that background, there's these really soft pastels, and probably that line, that pencil is your middle ground. And it draws your eye kind of almost depth, even though it's a 2D piece and flat. So for this one, I'm going to do an example, and I'm going to start with a focal point. So using this really bright magenta, I'm going to make a circle. This is also a shape, which is a good place to start. Your brain is really drawn to shapes that it recognizes, and using them in a consistent way throughout your piece creates harmony. And size variation creates interest as well.
Cool.
I'm also gonna.
You're not cleaning your brush.
I know, I'm doing wet on wet, so I'm gonna throw some orange in here. And the nice thing about when you use colors together that are next to each other on the color wheel, so warm colors with warm, you don't make mud, so they don't go neutral and brown. And you can get some nice mixing just right there on the page.
I was gonna say, you're using acrylic paint on watercolor paper, but you could use watercolor to do this, right? I mean, these concepts are gonna work in collage and in caustic. I mean, actually for any art form, even if you were doing a quilt.
Definitely, yes. Well, and the same goes with the colors you're using as well. Having light colors together, whether it's watercolor or even fabric, creates harmony and creates interest. And we are going to put a little contrast in here in a little bit.
By the way,
too.
I noticed when you dilute your water or your brush, or with water, you're not actually like dunking it deep into the water. I noticed that you're just sort of touching the top bristles. Is there a reason for that?
You don't want to dilute your paint too much because it actually breaks down and it'll start to not really be deep in color anymore. So you almost get too much water, and then it can actually fall off and crack off of your piece if you have too much water in there.
You don't want to do that.
No.
Now, when you're making all of these decisions, obviously you chose your colors so that everything would be cohesive. Now, the way that you're using your brush now as opposed to how you were using it before, is there one of these kind of compositional reasons that you're doing that?
Well, I'm really highlighting that original shape I put down now, and I'm using my brush really lightly so I don't mix too much and bring and push that white away and bring all that orange back out. So kind of dividing my page with color and then focusing on the focal point and making some line. I'm going to use my pencil here and really...
Into the wet paint?
Into the wet paint. So,
wow, and it still writes even in wet.
And this is etching, when you kind of scrape into that wet paint, and we're just creating some activity, so that active and passive space. So we have nice passive around, and then this active kind of really highlighting that shape again.
And I'm seeing the division between these two, and I'm seeing the, how you're focusing in on those two balls.
Yeah.
It's all coming together.
Now we're gonna get a little crazy here because I'm gonna add some contrast.
Yes. I love crazy.
And I'm kind of just deciding randomly, which I know sounds a little insane, but when you're using those elements, you can kind of push yourself to be a little more playful with them.
You're gonna paint with your pencil. Now, what was it that you just added?
I just added acrylic ink, black acrylic ink. And when you add contrast like this, and I'm using that same shape, so I'm going around and creating that active and passive space again, but contrast really pops. So that's really that foreground color, and it pushes everything back else into the background.
I can see that my eye is immediately drawn to the black. I see it, and there's so many artists who've used that black line. I mean, certainly Matisse comes to mind, that he did a lot of a heavy black line in his artwork. Now I see you're adding more shapes, more little circles.
Yep, and so there is a composition, and you always want to make sure you sign your piece. That really finishes it off. And you have a piece. And yeah, I put the extra circles just to kind of repeat that same pattern in there.
And I know you have one here, which is obviously dry, which is very, different and yet similar, a lot of the same elements. So even using the same paint colors over and over and the same techniques, you can get things that are very different.
Very different. And doing this also lets you build a body of work that is all consistent.
Speaking of a body of work, I mean, you've got a shoebox full of a body of work. And why is that?
Well, I took part in 100 Days, which is a project that's on Instagram and other places, but I did 100 days of abstract to really push myself almost to do sketches of all of these compositional concepts.
So let's look at a few of them. Let's start again with focal point. So obviously this is the one we already talked about.
Yep.
And again, here I can see the focal point, not to mention division and lots of other things. Do you want to page through those and we'll take a little peek at some other examples of focal point?
Yeah, I used a lot of different types of focal point, but you can see we have main objects and main shapes on the page. It's really fun too when you use complementary colors. So this is the blue and orange. They play well together, but the focal point really is each one of those objects you're really drawn to.
Great, and then the next element we were talking about was active and passive. So this one I can see here, the lines are active and passive. Do you want to talk about this one?
This one too, even though it all feels passive because of the pastels, all of that etching from the pencil and these lines really activate that space, and then it's calm everywhere else.
And this one?
You have a lot of activity going down the center, and this area here in acrylic ink becomes passive, and then you have white page as well that's passive.
It's just a good reminder when we look at all of these, like the division, there are so many different ways, and yet this is very similar to how you've done background, foreground. There are just a lot of choices, and you're not limited. And when you know these elements, then you can make choices that are informed instead of random guesses as to what should I do next. Tori, this was so great.